So firstly, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to participate with this project and welcome you to the first session of the Forestry Initiative. The session will be recorded and available from the download section of our website in case you miss anything. There's still limited availability on the other sessions, so I'd encourage you to sign up as soon as you can after this one. So in terms of housekeeping, there isn't much to say. You all seem to have mastered the audio and muting yourselves, so that's great. The only other thing that I'd say, no one has two computers going in the one room, as they might be interfering. So firstly, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to participate with this project and welcome you to the first session of the Forestry Initiative. The session will be recorded and available from the download section of our website in case you miss anything. There's still limited availability on the other sessions, so I'd encourage you to sign up as soon as you can after this one. So in terms of housekeeping, there isn't much to say. You all seem to have mastered the audio and muting yourselves, so that's great. The only other thing that I'd say, no one has two computers going in the one room, as they might be interfering. So other than that, I think we'll kick off. We're extremely lucky to have Neil Butcher here of OER Africa to speak to us today about open education resources. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank him very much for being here and taking the time to speak to us all about it. Just a brief intro, Neil is based in South Africa, from where he has provided policy and technical advice and support to a range of national and international clients regarding educational planning, uses of educational technology and distance education. Both as a full-time employee at the South African Institute for Distance Education and as Director of Neil Butcher and Associates. He's worked with various educational institutions assisting with transformation efforts that focus on effectively harnessing the potential of distance education methods and educational technology. Neil has travelled extensively through Africa conducting research on higher education, distance education and educational technology for a range of organisations, governments and donors. He is currently working as an OER strategist with SIDE on its new OER Africa initiative, which is funded by the Hewlett Foundation and is managing the Partnership for Higher Education in Africa's Educational Technology Initiative. So I guess without further ado, I'll hand you over to Neil. He's going to give, I guess, around a 30-minute presentation. There'll then be time for questions, which you can push through the chat function there, and you can do that during the presentation as well. And we'll go through these as time permits. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Neil if he's ready.
Yes, I am. Good afternoon, everyone. It feels a bit odd to be talking in one of these sessions. I've participated in several online conferences, but coming from South Africa, we tend not to do too many of these kinds of online conferences because the bandwidth constraints prevent us from doing this kind of interaction with people. I'm just trusting to faith that everyone can hear me all right. But please, if you're struggling to hear me at any time, we have had some international bandwidth problems in South Africa in the last week or two because of one of the undersea cables collapsing. So if you're struggling at any time to hear me, please just let me know on the chat facility. Also, as Neil indicated, please also post any questions or thoughts that you have as I'm talking. I will keep monitoring the chat facility while I talk. It's very difficult speaking at a distance like this to get a feel for whether or not what I'm saying is of any value or whether it's pitched at the right level. So please do use the chat facility just to let me know or to interrupt me and ask me questions. I have a very flexible presentation format here as always. What I thought I'd do by way of introduction is just very briefly tell you what OER Africa is all about. We are part of an initiative of the South African Institute for Distance Education, which is based here in Johannesburg. But OER Africa's headquarters are in fact in Nairobi in Kenya. And our primary function is on stimulating and advocating for the development of the concept of open educational resources in African education systems. Looking at the introductions that various people are making on the chat facility while we're talking, I note that a lot of you are from the second or the schooling sector, OER Africa at the moment is in fact focused on higher education, but I have also been working very closely for the last 6 or 7 years with the National Department of Education in South Africa to set up its National Education Portal, which has as one of its primary objectives the sharing of open educational content for use in South Africa's schooling system. So we are also very familiar with the concept of OER in the schooling system. I think I'm unfortunately going to assume that in introducing OER as a session that people are new to the concept. So for those of you who are familiar with the concept, I apologize for any duplication of ideas that you're already familiar with. But I thought I'd just sort of start by setting the scene in a particular kind of way. When we're interacting with academics in the higher education sector, the most typical response we get from academics tends to be, why should I bother to think about open educational resources? And we always find that a little bit perplexing when we hear academics talk like that, particularly because our understanding is that the higher education sector is supposed to be at the forefront of the knowledge economy around the world. And so it seems odd to hear people talking about developments taking place as a consequence of the proliferation of information and communication technologies, as if these are trends that they can ignore. So our tendency generally has been to indicate to people that the concept of sharing free content isn't really a question of choice, particularly if you're someone who's involved in producing educational content. The simple reality at a quantitative level is that as content of all kinds is becoming digitized, it is being shared by people, whether we want them to share it or not. Many academics and people in education planning seem to be operating on the assumption that the kinds of developments and trends taking place, for example, in the music and film industries, are trends that are bypassing the higher education sector, and that therefore, or the education sector as a whole, and that therefore have limited relevance in those contexts. And what we're trying to demonstrate to people is that that's in fact very far from the truth, particularly as students are spending growing proportions of their time online and increasingly are sharing content without the permission of the people who have produced that content. So just by way of example, what we've seen in many instances, just to use the University of Michigan as an example, is that the University of Michigan's on-campus bookshop was closed down in June 2009 simply because they were no longer able to justify staying alive because they weren't able to sell enough books anymore to the students. And the primary reason for that is that students are increasingly relying on digital content and e-books and online learning as the way in which they're interacting with content. But increasingly, for those people who are in the murky world of torrents and downloading music files illegally, if you go into those spaces, what you're finding is that increasingly students are actually sharing textbooks online without and allowing other students to download those textbooks without the requirement to pay for them. So, for example, if you're a medical student, you can download batches of anything up to 200 e-books at a time, which should cover you quite well for the duration of your studies as a medical student. So really the key point that we're trying to engage educational planners in is how do we ride this wave of open educational content rather than being drowned by it. And particularly what we're trying to encourage people who are in content production to do is to shift their thinking from why should I share my educational content to rather thinking about how can I stay in control of the process of my educational content being shared. Because the reality is that educational content is being shared. It's being shared often without the knowledge of the people who produced it. And unfortunately, the people whose content is more relevant and more useful to students are more likely to be the ones who are suffering from that process. So, in a sense, our point of departure is to say that engaging with this notion of open content is actually something that we don't have a choice about. The writing is on the wall, and the real question is how are we going to harness this trend in order to